in the past year, last several years, we've had a lot of concerns with brush piles being burned and escaping. So we thought it was a good opportune time to, have a conversation about some of the best practices associated with burning brush piles. I'm a member of the volunteer fire department, and I would say it's probably one of our number one calls that we get in the winter and late spring, early spring, are from brush piles that are being burnt and they smolder for a couple days. Snow goes away and rekindles, and it starts the grass up, and we get called out. It's also a really big issue on our prescribed burns if we have brush piles in the units or near our fire lines. Causes a lot of concerns to our burning operations. So it's really been something that that conversation needs to happen. And as we go forward in the future, this is going to become more and more of a thing. There's a lot more money coming in to do brush management, cedar removal, and more prescribed fire, because obviously we got cedar trees all over the landscape, and using fire is the best way to get rid of them. But a lot of times we have to do some cutting beforehand to prepare for those prescribed fires. A lot of times when you see preparing for these burn units, you'll see people out there piling these brush piles and then trying to get them burned prior to their burn. And there's a lot of different ways to pile them, and we'll talk about some of those ways and how they can be effectively managed. So to start off, burn permits are required in order to burn brush piles. In the state of Nebraska, we're under a prescribed burn or a burn ban all the time, so you have to get a burn permit. The good thing is a burn plan is usually not required by the volunteer fire department or fire district in order to obtain one of these burn permits. A lot of times you have to just meet up with the fire chief and get a permit when you want to. But I would say if you're burning a large number of piles or larger piles, it's always a good idea to write down a plan, burn plan for burning a large amount of brush piles. So it gives you a little bit of guidance and thoughtfulness and planning for your burns to get them done. We have there's several templates out there that are pretty short, 1 page, a page and a half, that are real simple and easy to fill out. And we can share those with you too at a later date. As usual, you should always contact your local fire district and fire chief well in advance to ask about obtaining a burn permit. So when that ideal day comes, you know the procedures and lead time needed to get that permit. We've had, some fire chiefs or fire districts, are only going to issue permits for a 1 day or for a couple days. Some will do 30-day permits. There are other times where the fire chief may not be available. So if you have an ideal day you need to burn, you need to know when you're able to pick up those burn permits. So by contacting them and kind of figuring out that permitting process, you're going to set yourself up for success in the future. And of course, when you decide that you want to start burning your brush piles, make sure you contact dispatch and let them know when you'll be burning brush piles, because they'll be producing smoke. Let them know how long you plan to be producing smoke, maybe a day or two, just to kind of give them an idea, if they're getting calls. A lot of times you will see people calling, especially if you're the only one burning at the time. But one thing that we've seen over the years is burning piles kind of begets other burn piles. One person starts burning brush piles, and everybody else in the area starts lighting them up at the same time. So if the piles continue to smoke past the expected time, make sure you contact the VFD and dispatch again, just to make sure, like listen, they're still burning or smoldering, and they're going to be going for another day, just so they don't have that expectation that that the fire is supposed to be out the following day, because it may be 1 or 2 days of kind of smoke from those piles. And then of course it's always good practice to contact dispatch again when you feel the piles are completely out. and this can vary in time, and we'll talk about that in a little bit about, how much lead time some of these piles can go. But that way, if you say, okay, my piles are out, and let's say, you got to run to town or something like that, and it starts smoking back up, then that way they know that there shouldn't be any smoke out there. So when we talk about the timing of brush piles, the most common time we see burn piles being burned are after snow events. And this has been very common practice for years and years and years, right? We get a good snow, everybody goes out there and starts their brush piles on fire, which, has worked really well in some cases it hasn't. Typically, this is at December through February time frame. Most likely, this time frame is usually most likely to have snow on the ground for longer periods of time. The November and March snows are a little bit riskier when you're thinking about doing when you're burning your brush piles. Just simply due to the fact that a lot of times we can get these really big swings in temperature. So we could get, a 10-inch snow in March, and 2 days later it could be up in the 70s, and it melts really fast. And that can happen. This is obviously what we've seen the last couple of years, like last year in January when it was 70 degrees out. So it's not exclusive to this time frame, but those are often times where they're much more likely to have those warmer temperature swings. And you got to think about piles are typically contain about 100 to 1,000 hour fuels. And that basically just means that these fuels, you know, take about 1,000 hours for them to release their moisture content, and then burn up. And so you could be talking several days for those for that wood to burn, depending on how much fuel moisture is actually in them. If the pile's been sitting for a year or two after cut, obviously it has a lot less fuel moisture. But if they're freshly cut, they tend to smolder a little bit longer for that. And then you got to think about your surrounding fuels when you're burning during this time of year. So your 1 hour fuels are usually dormant, or they are dormant that time of year, and they dry out very quickly. So if you think about when your fuels dry up, or the snow melts and the fuels dry, and there's still smoldering logs in your pile, you could certainly have a fair chance of escape happening at that time. So mainly the biggest pro of snow burning under snow is that snow cover helps provide that blanket on that fine fuels, so the surrounding landscape, any ember transport or anything like that is typically negated by that snow on the landscape. And that's why we see most of these brush piles, being burned that time of year. But there are some definitely cons associated with burning this time of year, right? We have difficulty of access, driving through heavy snow, unless you got a snowmobile that you're bringing up through there. When the snow melts, it usually gets really muddy. And so if there is escape or something like that, that hinders the response of the fire department through that situation. It's harder to have a pumper on hand, if you need it, because obviously with freezing temperatures, usually it can be difficult to have access to that. And the other thing that we see too is the smoke lift is usually terrible during this time of year. And we'll talk a little bit about, looking at smoke lift, but a lot of times you'll see in the winter when people are lighting brush piles, that smoke will go up into the atmosphere, hit that inversion layer, and that mixing height is really low to the ground. So it doesn't go up into the atmosphere and dissipate. And so you really have to think about, your wind direction, that the wind is going in when you're burning your pile, especially if they're a lot of piles or bigger piles that are going to produce a lot of smoke. So here's just an example of a winter brush pile. You can see that it's a really nicely stacked pile. It's a fairly large pile. Got going. It's got a couple inches of snow on the ground. That's able to kind of produce those cover those 1 hour fine fuels. But there's also an alternative to burning piles in the winter, and in a time frame of late spring into early summer, late May into June. These can work really great in high moisture years as well. And one reason why they're really great is because, when we see brush piles escape, they get into those dormant 1 hour fuels and they take off and they can cause pretty large fires. But when you're working in a high moisture environment, high moisture fuels, those 1 hour fuels are going to be actively growing with a lot of moisture in them. So if fire does get into those 1 hour fuels, it's typically a lot slower moving in those environments. But you also need to consider how much residual fuel that you have on the landscape. So if you have, if it was grazed heavily the year before, you don't have as much concern. But if you've got like, it's in a CRP scenario or non-hate or deferred year, yeah, you potentially could be looking at some higher residual 1 hour fuels that you would have to take into consideration when doing that. The other great thing about burning this time of year is that you have better access, right? It's a lot easier to access these brush piles. You have an availability of pumper units that you can bring on. So if it does get into some of those 1 hour fuels while you're sitting there, you can knock them down. We also see a little higher consumption of piles just because of the moisture content, warmer temperatures, and things of that nature uh, that help consume those piles. So again, it's a pros of that timing as fine fuels are full of moisture. Access to piles easier, have pumper on site. You also get way better smoke lift in that time frame. So when you're burning larger piles, they get it up into that atmosphere, higher levels. But the cons are is good moisture years are harder to come by, right? So it's kind of hit or miss from a timing standpoint, whether you're going to have good moisture because you don't necessarily know. And then, of course, it's not great for non-grazed, non-hit areas like CRP and deferment areas. Here's a couple of photos. These are from Oklahoma State University. You can see on the left here side, this pile, you can see it kind of crept into a little bit of those 1 hour fuels. Of course, looks like they had a pumper on site there, knocked that down. Looks like they had quite a bit of 1 hour fuels surrounding there. So, kind of went probably further than it normally would. On the right, you can see that pile is pretty well contained in there. Those 1 hour fuels are just full of moisture. There's not much residual vegetation on there as well. A couple photos by Ben Wheeler here shows really nice pile during that late spring time frame. You can see that it really held really quickly or really tight to that pile and didn't get away from them. But if it did, you'd have those pumpers on site. Another thing you could do is burning the piles during your prescribed fire ignitions. We try to avoid this as much as possible, just because it complicates things. A lot of times, we get extra ember transport, more embers, especially if needles are present, increase intensity of those. So Andy's going to talk a little bit here in a little while about how to plan a burn with brush piles, near the line and interior unit when you can use them. But we certainly do burn off quite a few piles during our prescribed fire operations, and they burn up really well, especially if the needles have gone off of them. They tend to burn up pretty good when there's no needles on there because you don't need those needles to kind of get them to go. So here's just a quick video of during a prescribed fire operation where you're doing a couple really old piles that were 4 or 5 years old, got torched up. You can see the higher flame lengths in there. If these had needles on them, they'd probably be, even more intense. But it did a really good job burning up these piles, and there was, nothing but ash left in that after that fire. But there's also some negatives associated with burning during a prescribed fire event. This video shows a dust devil interacting with a brush pile on a prescribed burn, and I'll let you show the video and speak for itself. So that's all the obviously consideration, when you're burning during a prescribed fire operation that you can run into. We see quite a few dust devils on our fire operations, and they can pick up, lift up trees like that and toss them, which is not only a danger or hazard to personnel on the ground, but potentially could throw something out the unit as well. So that's why planning is really important. I'm not going to get too much into ignition or brush piles. Couple things I just want to add on here is obviously never use straight gasoline. Gasoline is highly volatile and explosive, and people get sent to the emergency room every year by doing that. You can add fine fuels such as like old hay to the pile to help with ignition if you're having troubles getting something going. Um, that usually works pretty good. Use a drip torch, a fusee, propane torch to help get it going. If you're going to use any type of flammable liquid, make sure you use something that's like less flammable, such as kerosene or drip torch fuel, which is going to be like 70% diesel and 30% gas mixture. That helps take that kind of explosive context out of there. So, when I burn brush piles, I like to light them from the downwind side to help build up heat to ignite the rest of the pile, and that also helps dry the wood as it kind of burns back into it. Um, it can be it's just a little bit of a slower process, but I feel like I get a better consumption out of the piles when it does that. That radiant heat just kind of helps suck that moisture out, especially if the trees were, recently cut. It helps suck some of that moisture out before ignition to get going. And it'll also reduce intensity and ember transport. And instead, if you were lighting upwind, if you have good pile construction, it can be done, and you got good snow cover. They certainly light up just as fine. But just remember that, especially if you're burning in the spring or summer, that intensity and ember transport will be much higher if you're burning off piles that way. If you have access to a Territory, these are really cool. I don't have a video of one, but these are basically giant flamethrowers that make really quick work of these piles. But one thing is that they are very expensive and kind of a pain to maintain. So if you have experience with it or have access to one, they work really well, especially if you have a lot of piles. If you don't, the other thing that I've used in the past too is a leaf blower. I got a backpack leaf blower. And, sometimes when you're trying to get the thing going, you're, having a little bit of struggle, you can actually use that leaf blower to blow in oxygen into these things and kind of spark up that intensity, get that oxygen flow in there, which will help add fuel to that fire. When picking your ideal weather conditions, this can kind of vary. These are my preferences as far as ideal weather conditions in the wintertime. I like to have a little bit higher wind speed to help get those piles going. Smoke will be more of a problem if you do that, though. Obviously, that smoke's going to kind of hug the ground a little bit more and transport further. So that's something to consider. I like to do it about a day or two after a snowfall event. That's going to last at least a week. So a week of snow on the ground, and I like to wait a day or two because sometimes a day after snow you get that nice warm sun, and sometimes it'll melt some of that snow on top of the pile and helps it for easier ignition purposes as well. About 3 to 5 inches of snow is usually about perfect for when I'm burning my brush piles. It allows easier access. I'm not, waist deep up in the snow. You typically, if you have too much snow on the ground, a lot of times it can cover some of the oxygen flow from the base of the pile to get in there. So sometimes you could go in even with a tractor or a skid steer and clear out snow from that base to make sure that that wind flow gets underneath there. And then I like to use warmish, not, really warm, but warm sunny days because you get that really good smoke lift. And I usually start them, a little afternoon when that smoke layer, that mixing layer is a little bit higher for that initial smoke production. Because typically when you first light that brush pile is when it's going to be its smokiest. Once it really gets rolling and going, it typically, and it'll sometimes reduce the amount of smoke there. So, and in the spring and early summer, it's more ideal to have a smaller, less wind, less than 10 miles an hour, good humidity above 40%. Some of that research from Oklahoma State when they talk about spot fire ignition, above 35 or 40%, you have less of a chance of a spot fire occurring. So humidity above 40%, you get really good smoke lift usually during this time frame, which is good for the neighbors and everybody else to keep them off your back. You can also use cloudy, cool days to lessen those 1 hour fuel ignitions on top of it as well. So you can kind of use, typically we're talking about trying to get better ignition of fuels and wait for, humidity to lower, warmer days to get better kill on trees. But when you're burning these, you can use those cloudy, cool days to lessen those ignitions, surrounding ignitions when you're lighting your pile. The final thing I'm going to just jump into is I'm just going to show a little bit how to forecast good burn weather. I got several different websites that I'm going to go through. Most of them are all through the National Weather Service. Let's see if I can figure out how to exit. There we go. So I use NOAA almost exclusively. There are other sites out there that you can gather your weather from, but all that information that that comes from those sites basically comes from NOAA. So I like to go straight to the authority on this. But if you go to weather.gov and you can type in your location up in the box up here, or you can click on your county. Click. Once you click on that, click on your area or type in, it takes you to this landing page. And it has pretty good information right here that kind of shows you. So obviously, after a snow or you're forecasting a snow, you'd want to come in here and take a look to see what the next few days or next week's going to be looking like as far as, temperature wise. Are you going to get any snow melt? There are other snow days coming, things of that nature you can come on here and see. And right here, they have the extended forecast. You see, tomorrow it's going to be high of 34, low of 25, 45 Saturday, almost 50 degrees on Sunday. So we're going to see a lot of snow melt, over the next couple days, at least over here on this part of the state. And then a chance of rain on Monday. And then a more detailed forecast. So this goes to Monday. The detailed forecast right below it also goes till like next Thursday. So it gives you about a week. And this is a pretty good, it gives you a pretty good indication of, what the weather is going to be like. It may not be exactly perfect, but, they're usually not too far off in terms of, looking at high temperatures, things of that nature. So you can kind of go through and see what the highs are going to be, how much snow melt you're going to have, things of those natures to really help you plan whether it's a good time to burn those brush piles. And I usually plan for at least 5 6 days. I want 5 or 6 days easily of good burn conditions. I will tell a story about one time we actually logged some cedar trees off the property, and we burned the brush piles in the spring or late winter of 2012. And we received like zero moisture beyond like April 15th or something like that year. And those brush piles smoldered until like September or October that year. And it was a little bit different because it's like a slash pile instead of like logs. But we were lucky that everything around it had been, it was logs, so we didn't have any growing vegetation. It was all dirt surrounding it. But we've seen stuff rekindle after like 2 weeks, as unbelievable as that seems. And Mark will talk a little bit about that mop-up. But the other thing that you can do is, if you're looking at during the spring or summertime, burning those piles, another thing you could do is go to this hourly weather forecast right here. This has those boxes you can get rid of. I usually unclick the ones that I don't want. And then over here is where your mixing height is. So if you turn on this mixing height tab, this is a good way to show that mixing height. Transportation winds. Sometimes when I see it more often in the wintertime than I do in the springtime, but sometimes you get different surface winds than your transport winds. So I've seen it in the wintertime where we have a northwest wind, and somebody's burning a pile, and that smoke goes up in the atmosphere, moving from the northwest, and it goes up and goes southwest or something like that. So you get kind of different. So if you're burning really large brush piles, it could make a difference. So you click on submit, and this is going to show you kind of an hourly graph of what those conditions are going to be like, including what your wind direction is going to be, what your wind speeds are going to be. So like this would be southwest wind, southwest shifting to southeast or south, then southwest, southwest, southwest. And then over here on this side, it's going to be from the northwest. And then you can see up here, these are your wind gusts throughout the day there from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Tracks your relative humidity, your sky cover. Then here's your mixing height. You can see mixing heights this time of year. You're only looking at like 1,600 feet at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And at nighttime, you're looking at a mixing height of like 500 feet. So you're talking about when you're burning, that smoke is only going to go 500 feet off the ground and just basically hugs that ground for miles and miles and miles. So the piles can be sometimes kind of a nuisance that way when you're burning. But in that late spring, early summer time frame, you will see these mixing heights, go up to 5,000 feet, 4,000 feet, 3,000 feet, which really helps get that smoke up and out of there a lot better. A couple other tools that I use that I look at. Fire weather dashboard. This is basically the same thing. You come and click on this. It's going to give you kind of that same information. It's just a little bit of a different format that's got all the different things in here, so you don't have to click on any boxes or click off any boxes. And it's going to show you that same information. Here's your mixing height. That way you don't got to calculate it. It basically shows your in feet. Same thing with all the 20-foot wind directions, the wind speed, temperature, RH, any your snow or ice in the forecast, things of that nature. Another one I really like using is, for short-term forecast is looking at, it's called wrh.noaa.gov. this is a great way to see kind of what large scale patterns are happening. So you can kind of see what the temperature is going to do over the course of, 24 hours, 48 hours. You can select all your different parameters here, like your wind speed direction. And you can use your time slider here. And it's going to show those larger scale wind patterns. So it's going to show you, maybe having northwest winds to your west, but then those winds are going to be different to your east. So you might have some mixing variability in there. And then another tool I like to use this drought monitor. And one of the ways I use this is if you've been in drought, there's a really good chance that your brush piles or the fuel moisture in your brush piles are really low. So, which can be a good thing, right? Because typically, if you've been in drought and the fuel moisture is low in your 1,000-hour fuels, they tend to burn up more quickly. But if you've had really good rainfall and they've been soaking up a lot of moisture, they have that potential to be smoldering for longer. Same thing as if they've been cut recently, right? Recently cut trees tend to smolder a lot longer. So this gives you kind of a, of where you're out in the drought categories. And then the final one I like to use is this college into page. It kind of shows there's this really cool spot where you can actually see the satellite picture of Nebraska, so you can kind of see where snow cover is actually located at. And you can kind of turn on this natural color down here in this corner. And it kind of shows you where snow is still at. Where the snowfall is, and we use this to kind of say, all right, yeah, this is a good, there's good snow cover, a good snowpack all around, and you can also see the progression of snow melt on those warm days. You can kind of see this ridge in here where that's no snow, and then it kind of melts up that way as well. It helps kind of give a really good overview of kind of the snow cover on the landscape out there. So. There any questions before we move on to Andy? You can type them in the chat or raise your hand, I believe. Cool. All right, Andy, you wanna jump on?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you. All right, up next we got Andy Moore. He's with Nebraska Pheasants Forever. He works out in the Lost Canyons. I'll let you introduce yourself there, Andy.
Okay. Yep, Andy Moore. I'm a private lands biologist for Pheasants Forever and Game and Parks. I've been in North Platte, Lost Canyons area, helping landowners manage cedar and do prescribed fire the last 11 years or so. Can I share my screen here, Brian? Is that what I need to do?
Yeah, go to share right next to that mic.
And then content only.
Say what?
Well, I clicked on it and it has presenter mode or just screen, share screen.
Yeah, I usually just use screen.
Okay. First time for everything.
Yep. Yep, we can see it.
Can you see my fire photos?
Yep.
Okay. Can you let me know if you see any questions in the question chat box there, Brian?
Yep, sure will.
Okay. So my topic that I'm going to cover mostly is going to be planning for cutting cedar trees and also for prescribed fire. I would probably be lying if I didn't say that this topic has been one that I've learned the hard way as a biologist here through the Nebraska natural legacy cost share program, and as well, some of the landowners have learned this the hard way too. It's caused some stress, probably some money out of the pocketbook, and a lot of work managing these cedar piles. So the objective here is just safe and effective prescribed fire and safe and effective disposal of tree and brush piles. The content that I'm going to cover is the need and purpose of creating tree piles in the first place, some of the risks that we incur when we do that, minimizing the need to burn piles, creating fire breaks and burn units, where we should place tree and brush piles in the landscape and where we should not place them. Then just a couple planning tips at the end. So the first question I pose here is, why do we cut trees in the first place? And this assumes that the landowners, mainly in Nebraska, especially central and western Nebraska, are dealing with grassland values. So they want their property to be effective for rangeland, livestock forage production, grassland, wildlife habitat species. And in that regard, many of these trees are what we would call invasive. 100 years ago, we would have fires that would take care of many of these trees, but we don't have that now, and they're popping up like weeds. So the best way to manage trees in the first place is prescribed fire. But if we already have them, in order to get a prescribed fire done, we're going to have to cut some trees and make a fire break. That's one reason we cut trees. Many landowners also don't like the aesthetic of the burned trees or the skeletons on the landscape. Ecologically, once they're dead, that's great. They're not growing anymore. They're not using resources. But they'll stand there for several years or a decade. Eventually, they'll break off, blow around, roll downhill, and they can be a bit of a pain. So landowners like to cut trees to reduce skeletons. Another reason we cut trees is to actually use them as fuel, to burn them and create radiant heat that will kill other trees. And when we do this, we can turn a good prescribed fire into a great prescribed fire. If you can see my mouse, 10 to 15 years ago, if we did a burn on this unit and killed a lot of the 4, 5, 6 foot trees, that would be great. If we got a 10-footer here or there, that's good. But nowadays, after some experience and with a few techniques, landowners would expect to probably kill all these cedar trees. That would be their goal. And if they didn't, they would be disappointed. But along with cutting these trees and using them as fuel, it's kind of the proverbial double-edged sword. They also create a little bit of liability and challenges. The greatest challenges, specifically with cedar, come from the volatility that's found in the scales and the branches, and just when we make a pile, the massive amount of fuel that's all in one spot. And the two greatest problems that we've had from burning piles, both during the winter and during prescribed fire, is that the embers can be lofted a long, long way. And when they land, if they're still hot, they can catch grass, other trees, other brush piles on fire, and that can be a challenge to contain. Basically, our fire is out of bounds, burning wild where we don't want it. The other one is just smoldering time. After you burn a big pile, there's maybe some logs and bigger branches that didn't burn, but there's for sure going to be several inches of ash. And underneath the ash are all these little embers that can stay hot for days, weeks, and like Brian said, sometimes even months. Of course, there's other risks as well, and most of these are like the duh risks. There's large flames. We've seen flames that are a couple hundred feet high when burning brush piles. Along with that comes really intense radiant heat, so you just got to look out. If there's receptive fuels around this brush pile when you're burning it, you can get a rapid rate of spread. So obviously when we're doing prescribed fire and we have piles out in the middle of our burn unit, when those go, we see the fire activity really take off and spread much faster. Again, with the lofted embers, they can be launched up in the air over our fire lines to create a wildfire that's out of bounds. This also would be another name for a spot fire. And then, of course, the flare-ups days later, when the wind blows, throws an ember somewhere into receptive fuel that we weren't planning on burning. It's another way that we could have an escape or a wildfire. So we know that these create some risks. They've been a challenge in the past. The question is, how do we manage it? And I think the best way to manage these risks of brush piles and burning brush piles is to minimize the number of piles that we create in the first place. One of the best ways to do that is to use prescribed fire regularly. We know our landscapes are adapted, at least in the central part of the state, adapted to fire every 5 to 10 years. And I don't think ecologically or from a livestock production standpoint, you would see any negative consequences from burning in that 5 to 10 year fire return interval timeframe. And then if you didn't have trees to start with, you may never have these problem invasive trees that you have to deal with. I would call that reducing and preventing, woody species encroachment. That's probably the best tool. The next best tool, if you have trees and you need to cut them, is to reduce the number of piles that you make. One way you can do that is using a mulching machine. In the past, many of these trees have been cut with a shear. They just cut the tree off at ground level and then they move the tree into a pile or cut it in, or stuff it somewhere to use it as fuel. If you have a mulching machine, it can literally grind it right down to the ground, especially the smaller trees. Just turns them into small little pieces of woody mulch that eventually will turn back into soil. Maybe they may even be good for the soil. Many of the contractors nowadays, more and more of them are getting these mulching machines. More of the equipment has the larger size and hydraulic capacity to run one of these. And they just seem to be more common on the landscape. There is, however, one challenge with mulching that we should be aware of, and that's not to mulch within 50 feet of a fire line. So where you plan the perimeter of the burn unit, where you plan to put down fire, do not do the mulching within 50 feet of that. And again, the reason is this mulch can be a little bit coarse. If it's a good sized tree, it can actually create a bit of a pile. And when that ignites, it can smolder for a long time, similar to what a brush pile can. And when a gust of wind comes along, it can blow an ember out of there. So it's great to do, just keep it more 50 feet off, more towards the interior. So what I'm going to cover next is specific to burn units and fire breaks. If I could go back to 11 years ago and give this presentation to myself, I certainly would have done that. I would have been of a better service to many landowners and probably would have learned a lot of lessons that we didn't have to learn the hard way by creating piles and then having to move them or having to burn so many piles during the winter in less than optimal conditions. So the best piece of advice I can give for landowners is just to plan ahead. The first part of a project should be the fire break. And I have this little aerial image attached that shows an example of a burn unit and our fire break. Any of the resource professionals with Pheasants Forever, NRCS employees, some of the NRD employees, people that are doing this for a living could assist landowners to make maps like this. We can outline the perimeter of the burn unit. So that's where we want to go. It's represented here by this orange line. So that's literally where we plan to lay down the fire. We can see that there's a lot of trees in this landscape, so that landowner is going to have to cut trees to implement this fire break. Our local specs call for 150 to 300 feet of cedar-free width. So they'd have to cut 150-foot width, cut all the trees out of that area. That's represented on this map by these two pink lines. So from one pink line to the other would be 150 feet wide. And then I would recommend landowners plan and implement the fire break first before they start doing the interior tree cutting. That way they don't have piles where they plan to burn down the road. And when they're doing both the fire break and doing the interior tree cutting, move the trees that are cut 300 feet or more inside the unit if at all possible. And that's a minimum. That's our local fire break spec. There may be occasions where it has to be more than 300 feet. But for the most part, if you can get them 300 feet inside, then you can just do the prescribed burn down the road without having to worry about moving or burning those piles beforehand. And again, that's represented from our orange line out to the yellow lines on either side. So that would be a 300-foot width, and on the inside, a 300-foot width. We can make maps like these that can work with GPS smartphone app, so the contractor or landowner can actually have this map on their phone with a GPS dot that shows where they're going so that they can help manage this while they're doing the tree cutting. And the question arises, isn't it expensive to cut trees and then move them that far? And the answer is yes. Anytime you have to move the fuel, it is more expensive. My answer to that is there's lots of options to help landowners offset that cost. We have cost share programs through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, Game and Parks, Natural Resources Districts. Pheasants Forever has had programs in the past, and the Nebraska Forest Service also has cost share to help with fire break preparation. They're there. They're really funded right now. I strongly recommend that landowners use them. These types of projects rank really high. It's almost to the point now where landowners can't afford not to deal with invasive woody species like cedar because the cost share options are so good. Okay, one other thing that I think could help manage disposing piles is to make our burn units larger. And that may seem a little counterintuitive, because if you have a larger burn unit, aren't you going to have more piles, more trees cut? The answer is yes, it does, but there's a couple things that would also be an advantage. When we make really big burn units, which we're working on some now that are 6,000 acres or larger, and in the future we'll probably do some that are even larger than that. Generally, we spend the time and money to make really, really good fire breaks around the outside perimeter. Oftentimes we're using county roads, which are great, or we use really wide canyon bottoms that can support a lot of fire on that periphery. So that alone provides some buffer space for burning these piles. And it also is going to allow more interior space, which in the long term is going to be defensible space. The trees will be cut in there. We'll have the fire break ready. When a pile is burned, that whole interior may actually be ready for prescribed fire. So if an ember lands in there, it's not as big a deal. There also would be if a pile should get out of control, there would be more access and availability to fight that fire for our VFD volunteer firefighters. Okay, so we know where not to put fuels around the perimeter. If we can get fuel or our heavy, our trees and our piles at least 300 feet inside the burn unit away from the fire line, we've had pretty good results. Making piles are also called, we use the term cut and stuff. So landowners and contractors will cut the cedar trees, stuff them under other cedar trees and use them as fuel to burn those other cedar trees. My disclaimer here is that this should only be done in geographies where the burn association and the burn boss and the fire chief have the skills and experience to manage this type of fire behavior. If you have a new burn association or people that don't have experience fighting fire, you probably don't want to put big brush piles all over the interior because the flames are really high. There's a lot of heat. It can move relatively quickly, and it's just a lot to contain. But we're fortunate out here where I work that we have burn associations with 15 years of experience. They do a tremendously good job. They have a great track record, and they can get the results they want when they use this cut and stuff method. Again, this needs to be at least 300 feet in the interior of the burn unit. And again, that's a minimum. If you can get it further in, that's great. And there may be instances where the burn boss, the local fire chief, or a program specification requires it to be more than that. So just be aware. So where should you cut and stuff? Heat rises. And if you have a limited budget to cut trees, and who doesn't, then the best place to cut and stuff is at the bottom of these steep cedar choked slopes, because when you burn the pile, the flames and heat will rise and it can get some of those trees above it. You can also cut and stuff at the tops of slopes, and if you do that both at the bottom and top, you have a very good chance of probably burning out most of the cedar trees that are in between. The mouths of narrow canyons, which there's an abundance of out here in the Lusk Canyons. Again, heat rises. So if you have a situation like this, if you can see my mouse, the best thing a landowner or contractor can do is cut trees down here at the base, maybe cut in a little ways as far as they can get equipment, stuff it, and then make some piles here at the base. And when they ignite it, they could burn out this whole canyon. If you know the wind direction of your prescribed burn, the best place to pile those trees is upwind, kind of like at the base of the slope. If you can pile on the upwind side of your thick cedar stands and let the wind carry the flames and heat into the trees, that can work well. Although we don't always know the wind direction of our prescribed burn well beforehand, or we may want to prep a burn unit for any wind direction to keep it flexible. If you can target female trees, the local term I've heard is blue mamas, because they have the bluish seeds. Those are females. They disperse the seed that pops up year after year and continues this problem that we have. If you can target those, that's great. Basically, anywhere you want to burn cedars 300 feet or more on the inside of the unit, for the most part, go for it. Cut and stuff. You know, if all your burn association and all the partners are on board. Except there are still places, even on the interior of the unit, where we don't want to cut and stuff and make piles. So again, I'm going to bring up this map with our fire break and our fire line. From our orange out to our yellow 300-foot buffer line, that space is a no pile zone. It doesn't mean you absolutely can't make piles there, but a landowner needs to know if they're making piles in that area, they're going to have to get rid of those piles or burn them during the winter before this prescribed burn takes place. So if there's any way you can avoid that, I would do it. And again, this requires significant planning in advance. I like to preach the 3-year rule. You know, after you know that you want to treat an area, you're planning a prescribed burn, you get your conservation plan map, you have the perimeters planned out, you apply for the cost share. Year 1 should be spent making the fire break and then doing the interior tree cutting. Year 2 is a grazing deferment. You can finish your tree cutting if you have to, but that year you just try not to disturb it. Don't graze it. Let the grassy fuel grow. And then year 3 is the prescribed burn. So we're talking a significant planning time period. There's also this kind of technical, tactical situation we have with our burn units, especially in rugged landscapes where we've had real challenges in the past trying to maintain our fire breaks. If you can see my mouse, the types of situations that I'm referring to are generally when our fire line and our fire break follows a ridge. So if you see my mouse in this line, it follows a ridge top. That's the main ridge where the fire break is. And then over here on the right, we have a canyon bottom. So that's the low ground. In between, we have ridges that connect the two. The challenge arises if we were to just cut and stuff this like we normally would. We'd maybe make piles here. We'd make piles here. We'd ignite it. And then we would get some serious fire behavior, like 300-foot flames. They could race up these canyons. And if our crew at the top is not yet ready, it could slam that line, throws embers way over here. It's just been a challenge in the past. So What I would recommend in situations like this, where your fire line goes up to a ridge, is what we call a fuel reduction. So the areas in red, instead of cutting and stuffing, we would want to either cut those trees and move them back away, like into the canyon, and then most likely burn that pile during the winter. Or you could use mulching equipment that's not going to create a pile in the first place. We would like to do the same at the top, even within greater than 300 feet from our fire line. It can still be the burn boss or a fire chief may want you to do some fuel reductions there. There's other options too. I mean, if a landowner is inclined, you could consider doing what we would call a burnout, where they actually could stuff it and then burn the top and the bottom and everything in between during the winter when there's snow on the ground. That can be a handful and can create other challenges. The best thing is probably just to do the fuel reduction and get the fuel out of there. This can be especially problematic, say if we're gonna, the side's burned and then we're gonna look at burning this part of the property. Say we were planning a northwest wind and we have a canyon here coming up to the ridge that's running to the south and east. If we get a northwest wind, it could really blow through that canyon, almost like a Venturi effect, and make some really gusty winds on this ridge. That could be a challenge for firefighters. So again, no piles here and fuel reductions at the base of the canyon and at the top. And this would be something technical enough. I would recommend you have a resource professional like NRCS or someone like myself could help plan these types of burns. Or guys like Scott Stout, Bob Fisher, and there may be other burn planners out there that are doing the same thing kind of as contractors or technical assistants for NRCS. There's people around that can help. One other area that's been a problem for both winter burning piles and prescribed fire is when that pile is on, kind of perched in the landscape on a ridge that's kind of out in the wind. So again, these are places that are higher in the landscape and not sheltered by other trees or other topography. In this instance, this is a high plateau on the left side of the image. Actually a crop field or an old crop field or a short grass or mixed grass type of prairie, but it's very flat. At one time it was farmed and it has very little trees and no other topography up there to protect it from the wind. Say this landowner wanted to cut this unit, and he wanted to even cut the trees on the ridge, which he probably would. I would recommend that he kind of starts lower in the landscape, cuts his way up, and then let gravity do the work, and eventually have those trees fall into the bottom of the canyon. And there, if it's far enough interior, he can just burn them during the prescribed burn. If he has to burn them during the winter, then he can make a nice big pile down here in the bottom of the canyon. Especially out here towards the edge, probably would not want to cut and stuff, just for the fact that the wind's going to blow there and he could have problems with flare-ups days later. Also, what he does not want to do is cut these trees on this flat area and just make a big pile here, because again, our most prominent wind direction is the northwest, and that pile could smolder for days, weeks, and months, and require either a lot of babysitting or water to extinguish or something like that. So again, try to avoid any piles or cutting and stuffing on these exposed windswept ridges. The most common wind again is north and west. Often those can be gusty winds as well. The other problem is our really hot and dry winds, and most of those are from the south. So that should be taken into consideration when you're choosing where to pile or not to pile. So here's some other common sense things, but just for reiteration, places where we should not pile trees, what I would call infrastructure, whether it's a burn unit or not. And one of the biggest ones is power lines. This has been a real challenge for our prescribed fires because we have so many old power lines with old cracked wood poles. Most power companies don't even have specs for how they want to prepare them. And the ones that have, even when we follow them, we've had problems. So what I would recommend is you call a power company, whether you're planning to make a pile or to burn one or do a prescribed burn. A lot of times they'll even send an agent out to the prescribed burn or to look at your site beforehand and tell you what you need to do. Then I would recommend you do what they tell you to do and then do a little bit more because it can be a real challenge. Obviously, buildings, haystacks are some things we encounter. There's a lot of solar panels on the landscape nowadays, especially for solar wells. Any type of infrastructure that's out there, hunting blinds. And whether you're doing a prescribed burn or not, consider the wind direction when you're going to have to get rid of that pile. You know, what's the most common wind direction? What's the best wind direction going to be when you burn that pile? Because it's not just the height of the flames, but the wind is also going to push the flames towards things or away from things. So just keep that in your back of your mind. So there's a lot of ways to avoid burning piles, but eventually if we make them, we're going to have to get rid of them. Again, if you must burn the piles, those wind perched piles on windswept ridges can really be a challenge, so avoid that if all possible. There's a lot of nuances to making piles, where they should go in the landscape, but one of the things that I've heard from many contractors and landowners is that they like larger piles. The larger piles tend to consume even the bigger logs and branches more completely, so they spend less time pushing them together and babysitting them. And also, the more completely that the pile burns out, the less likelihood that it'll smolder for a really long period of time. Really, the best scenario is if all the material is just consumed and burns out, and larger piles will allow that to happen. Another thing that should be helpful is if you make the pile in an that's accessible. So a pile that you can drive up to a truck is going to be easier to ignite for one, but also you're going to be more likely to go and check on it down the road when it needs monitored, if it's smoldering, if we expect a warm, wind gusty or really dry day and you have to go check on it, you're going to be more likely to do that if you can drive right up to it. When do you pile trees? Again, this goes back to planning, but I would not pile trees until the burn unit is decided. And even when you have all the landowners that are included in the burn unit sign a form of agreement or intent to participate in that prescribed burn. The best is to cut and pile the trees at least a year before the burn, then they have time to dry down, and trees that have dried for a year tend to burn a little bit better. Also, you don't necessarily want to be out there cutting trees during your deferment year. What you want to be doing is growing grass and not driving over it or creating bare ground by cutting trees. Again, a year is usually year to two is a good time frame for the trees to dry down, and they will burn a little bit better. But after 2 years, they should still have their scales, or what you see is the red part of the tree after it's dead. Those are the scales. They're really volatile, and it will help the pile consume better if those are still intact. If you wait 3 years or more, those scales could fall off and the piles will be a little bit more challenging to burn. I have one other thing that I touch on here, and this relates to weather. Sean Jacobs, a meteorologist here at the Weather Service in North Platte, gave a presentation this week, and he had mentioned a weather phenomenon called ridge collapse. And this is kind of a watch out situation. The best way I can describe it is air that rises or low pressure, similar to a thunderhead that we can see here in this photo. But oftentimes Southeast Colorado is a pretty warm landscape. We'll have air that heats up and rises really well. And that low pressure, that rising air moves our direction. But as it rises, it cools. And eventually all that rising air will collapse. And as it collapses, it warms back up, comes back towards Earth. And what we get are really strong winds, warm, dry air. And oftentimes it can be extreme. One example of this that you guys may remember was last April the 22nd. And it was the day that the 702 fire ignited, which was a catastrophic fire in south central Nebraska. Here in North Platte that day, I measured temperatures up to 97 degrees, winds that blew or gusted up to 63 miles an hour, and a relative humidity that was as low as 9%, which is the worst fire weather I've ever seen by far. There's no amount of snow on the landscape that could stand up to this type of weather, even for an hour or two. This type of weather, if we have any type of fire on the landscape, the snow is going to melt, all the fuels will become dry, and that fire is going to get away, because when conditions are like this, pretty much anything will burn. Fortunately, excuse me, we don't get these extreme conditions very often. But oftentimes we do get a milder version of these warm, dry air masses moving into our region. Usually it's more of a Chinook wind. So these would be warm, dry west winds that come off the Rocky Mountains. And as the air descends, it warms up and it gets really dry. That's pretty common during the months of January, February, March, which also overlaps our prime pile burning time frame. So just be aware of that. The other good news is that the meteorologists see these coming usually several days in advance. They said they can see them 7 to 8 days in advance. So if you're looking at that forecast, you should be able to see those conditions and avoid them. If you have things burning, mop it up, that type of situation. So my take-home points from this: when we're making piles, doing prescribed burns, burning piles during the winter, make sure you know the risks. Make sure you know what you're getting into. If you don't have to make piles of cedar trees or other woody species, don't do it. You can burn frequently. You can mulch. You can use prescribed fire to burn trees on the interior of the unit. You don't necessarily have to make all those piles. Plan ahead, plan well ahead, plan years ahead if you can. Talk to your neighbors, plan out a really good burn unit, and take all those steps before you cut any of the trees in the first place. That way you won't end up having to move piles of trees or burn them during the winter. And when we're cutting trees and we have to move that fuel, make sure we're moving it away from our fire break and away from any important infrastructure. And if we can, let's move the fuel to the interior of the burn unit and use it. It's actually a little bit of an asset there instead of a liability, and it can be useful and it's much safer. That's what I had. Maybe if we had a quick question or two, we could. Otherwise, I think we're going to turn it over to Mark Frickel.
Not seeing anything in the chat currently.
Okay.
All right, next up is going to be Mark Prickle. He's going to take us home and talk a little bit about mop-up when you got piles. Pretty important part in the process of make sure you're burning brush piles or even on your prescribed burn when you have piles in there. So Mark, you want to take us home?
You have my presentation, Brian?
Yep, we can see you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you for joining us tonight. Appreciate the invite to visit about this. Mark Frick, I work for the Nebraska Forest Service, Conservation Forester. Yeah, a lot of learning has been done in the last years as far as cutting trees and piling them and burning them here in Nebraska. I work out of the North Platte area, work with Andy quite a bit, and yeah, quite a bit of experience burning piles, but yeah, just unique challenges everywhere, and hopefully can make it safer and really just more efficient. And anytime you have woody vegetation, it needs to be managed. and you're essentially going to end up with slash. So whether you end up doing it during a broadcast burn, pile burn, mulch, you're still going to have to figure out what to do with that slash. And yeah, my presentation will talk about really just about after you light the pile, what we need to be looking at, and then even go into a little more about pile location and building. Hate to say it, but really cutting and piling is 50%. Lining the piles is 1%, and mop up of piles can be 49% of the work. If we get the right weather, like we've been fortunate to have now, I hope lots of you have been out burning piles. So following Brian's presentation and taking a lot of those really, that good planning from Andy, hopefully we can cut down on this 49%. But if we just throw piles on the landscape, cut the trees and pile them and do, a mediocre job along all levels, you're going to spend just as much time out there, maybe not as far as cutting, but a lot of time monitoring, a lot of time messing with those piles. So, and we just want to reduce the workload of the volunteers. So here's some of my mop-up hot tips, and we'll go a little more detail with these. But really, at the very beginning, if you build that pile correctly, you're going to cut mop-up way down. So that starts with the initial cutting. Another big thing is you really do not want to bury logs or stumps. It's real tempting to dig a hole, and I'm not talking like a landfill, but dig a hole, throw the logs in it, and forget about it. If you do that along the edge, there's enough oxygen in there that the logs will continue, or stumps will hold heat for a long time. If it's a stump, it'll follow a root wad, a root out, and actually could pop up on the other side. The stumps happen quite a bit on the broadcast burning, but yeah, you're actually just holding heat in there. And forgive me, a lot of this presentation is working in the canyons. Understand we got landscape piles, people dealing with 50, 100 piles, more to people, dealing piles in their yard. So some of these generic footages maybe aren't pertinent, but you can take away with it what you want. But before I leave a pile, the edge should be 100% cold. That's going to reduce that creep into the 1 hour fuels. If you got a log smoldering on the edge, the sun comes out, dries out that grass, that's where your creep's going to start happening. General rule of thumb is 5 foot. Again, if it's a small slash pile, it could be a foot. If it's a huge pile and you got a lot of concern, a bigger footage that you actually know is cold is good. And always just continue to monitor. A lot of times we're building piles where there's slope, and in snow and ice conditions, you can't get your truck, and maybe you can't even get your side-by-side up there. But if you got a pile up on the slope or up on the ridge line, or even up the valley where you can't get to it, get out of your vehicle and go walk around it. A lot of times there's heat there, even if it's not smoking. Another tip I got is consume as much of the material as possible. So that involves a really good pile, built well, tight and compact, and then having the ability to, the term is chunk, move all that material further and make sure all the material gets consumed. Because if there's no material left to burn, chances of escape are minimized significantly. When you are pushing these piles, don't push dirt into the pile. Again, that just makes stuff burn longer, makes kind of a mess. At the end of it, once you start pushing that material towards the middle of the pit, let it sit there, consume everything, but don't leave a big ash pit that's super hot that the wind can just pick up and push out. You can spread that out and let it cool off. Again, like the other guys I talked about, pay attention to the wind forecast. This will determine how far the embers go and what you need to do as far as mop up. Can you let that pile consume for 3 days? Can you keep messing with it? Or do you need to light the pile and then promptly put it out? The only way to make sure a pile is out is to cold trail it with your hand. There's no other way. A lot of times you don't need to do it if there's snow on the ground. You don't need to do it all the time. But again, if you light piles in mediocre conditions, you're gonna have to put the work in to put them out. And don't quit monitoring the pile until it's cold. So some of the tools for pile burning, there's more, there's other things needed, but the main things are the ignition device, got the drip torch. If you're burning piles that were created by machinery, and if they're large machine piles, having a skid steer to push that material in at the right time to keep the pile consuming is super beneficial. Understand that you're driving in hot ash, that you're paying attention to that, and each operator should have some experience or reach out to guys who have ran the machinery pushing. Hydraulics can get hot. Bad things can happen to your machine. A simple shovel will go a really long ways. Stir ash with it, move snow to put it out if you need to. Anytime you're engaged in any fire activity, you should have some sort of hand tool. I like having a side-by-side with the tank. It's usually on site or handy. That's a great tool, or even your four-wheeler that you use for spraying weeds. Just having some sort of water source available. If there's a bunch of snow, like we have here in North Platte right now, maybe that's not necessary to have out on the site, but it should be up and running, maintained, and you should just be able to get it in there. In case the weather changes, to hotter and drier, and you need to put that pile out, you need to have some way to put that pile out if needed. And the handy chainsaw. A lot of times, working with the woody vegetation, if a contractor went out there and cut the trees with the shear, they handled all the material, and now you as the landowner going out to pile, you maybe didn't have any need to have a chainsaw or that tool was never even involved. But a couple of things that you can do with the chainsaw is, if the pile was, I'd call it weakly built, maybe not push tight, you can sometimes you can cut that material up in a corner of that pile to get it lit. You can make yourself a little nice corner of the pile just to get a bunch of heat generated. Done that on piles that were poorly constructed. Another tool for it, another reason to have that tool is if you need to put the pile out again, say last March, I believe it was March, and we were lighting piles in a blizzard, and the sun came out, 2 days later, and we needed to put the piles out, and we still have logs smoldering. You can actually go in and cut the burning end of a log off, throw that inside your fire, and then you could prevent the rest of that log burning. A little technique, but not, just make sure that you're cutting all the hot stuff off of it. Technique used for pile burning as well as broadcast burning. But if you're out there messing around, having a working chainsaw is nice. I know it's work, but I would say it's a necessary tool. Here's this kind of shows the results. You can see the skid steer here in the smoke, but this was a fairly large landing pile. But lit the whole thing, let it burn down a while, and then just started slowly pushing that material in from the edges, making sure not to grab any dirt, just skimming the top off, and pushing that stuff towards the center just to continue the burning of the material. Even with a really good constructed pile, a lot of times you're going to have a lot of logs down here in the bottom that aren't going to completely consume. If it's out of the way and you have no need to be there, it doesn't matter. That stuff will consume. But here, where a lot of the land usage is for ranching, I've learned that, yeah, having that debris out in the pasture is not wanted by the landowner, and cause problems later, i.e. getting a stop in a tire, or if you end up trenching, and having that debris can cause problems. So there's different ways I've learned, at least depending on what the land usage is, and that goes into pile and where you put piles. But this is the best way. This will ensure that the edge is cold. There's not a lot of, a heavy ash pit there to hold anything. There's no logs. You can do this first shift of burning, probably be able to walk away with this just fine overnight, and then come back in and continue to monitor. And if the snow stays around, you can just let that stuff keep consuming. You can keep pushing it together. At the end, you'll be using your hands and throwing, 3 sticks on top of each other for a campfire, if you really want to get 100% consumption. After that's completed, as you're walking around your piles, really recognizing where heat is. If it's early in the morning and the sun's not on your piles, a lot of times you aren't going to see smoke, if there is. And then as the day goes along, that sun will show that smoke for you a lot of times. But you can use your nose. You can start smelling heat that way. So if you're down in the drainage bottom and you have 20 piles out there, and you can smell it out there, so you can slowly track down where that heat is. And even the color, you can see that hotter white is where that ash is. So obviously right up here, right along the edge, right along where this grassy fuels is. Yep.
The PowerPoint is still showing tools on my
really?
screen. Yeah.
Oh. How about now?
No, it's still
Did it
showing
change,
the
Brian?
still showing the tool slide. Andy, is it still tools on yours?
Yes, it is. Wonder if you need to reshare it or.
Yeah, I'll stop sharing. Share my screen. What do you got now?
It's your first slide.
Just my first slide. That's not what I see.
Well, it's not in presentation mode yet either.
Interesting. It is on my screen.
Well, it's not your first, maybe it's not your first slide. It says mop up, cutting and piling 50%, mop up 49%.
No, that's my first slide. Do you have I'm cycling through it. I don't know if it has to do with my internet or what. Do you want to pull up the copy I sent you? Because I don't know what else to try real quick. I've stopped sharing.
Did you send it to Teeter?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up right now here.
Okay.
All right. I think this is the slide you were on.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. So, yeah, if you can see on the top of that slide, there's a log there and some white ash, and that's right adjacent to your grassy fuels. No smoke showing. That's what's going to bite you after 2 days, 3 days. Snow left. They'll creep out right in the grass on you and run up, that south aspect. So that's just part of that recognition, and actually just needing to get out, use your hands, use your nose. And again, if you're lining up 50 piles, it's intimidating when you know there's only a couple of you, but it's part of the responsibility I think you have if you're in this situation, you need to get it done. Next slide.
Mark,
Yep.
what's more risky, white ash or gray ash?
I'd call it like yellow. Yellow is like really where that heat is. I don't know. What's your opinion?
I don't know, you said white ash was close to the edge, so it sounded risky.
Yeah. That's just generally where the heat tends to be. Once it's black, really once it turns, like if you put water on white ash, it'll turn gray. And then as you can you go back a couple slides, like it'll be black, and that's generally cold coals. So I think the biggest thing is that monitoring side, and it's going to depend on your weather. If you can't access piles, there's lots of places that you won't just be able to drive up to it and look at it. Cause problems. So I'm going to slide into pile construction and location and tie in a little mop-up with that as well, just because how you construct the piles and where you do is going to limit the amount of time spent mopping up. So this is some piles I created when I first came here, used to working in the general forest, where the user activities were different. So I put the piles out in the middle of the canyons. It just removes it away from other vegetation except grass, and they're down in the valley bottom, really easy to get to. As far as mop-up goes, makes it super simple. I can drive to them. You can push from all sides and not have any problems. And then as far as pile size goes, the general rule is as tall as they are wide. And when you're dealing with a cedar tree that's average size 30-foot tall, 30-foot wide, you're going to have to create a pretty big pile, and it requires a bigger machine to get them tight. And then you need to make sure that they go tall. It's really easy to make a windrow pile, but they do not consume well. You might not even get them to light. Tried some of those and that did not work. So understand where you're piling it. If out here in the middle, it's just going to it took more work. I was able to get a lot of material burnt up, but now I'm going to have to go back and continue to clean it up, or just understand that you're going to have debris in the valley bottoms. If you can run fire, a broadcast burn, over top of it, then they'll continue to help get rid of some of that debris. Keep going. Next slide. This one, go back up one. Yeah. So these, they were never classified as a pile, but this is kind of how I ended up cutting trees on a slope. You would have had to cable them all the way down. So in this situation, you would end up making hand piles where you actually need to use a chainsaw, delimb all the limbs. And these are old and really difficult to deal with, but when they're green, you would delimb them, you can make really neat hand piles with them. The issue with that is it's probably easier to end up cabling them off the hill and pile them at the bottom, or using some of the other techniques talked about before. But if you need to, and there's reasons that you're going to need to do this, you got to get a chainsaw and you got to make those piles. You go out there and try to light those piles, they're not going to burn. So and if you do make piles on slopes, again, there's situations you're going to have to understand when you're lighting and mopping up that you're going to be on foot, or I'm going to drag those out to them to put them out. So And think well in advance before you ever cut a tree where you're going to put it and what the work's going to be involved to get it to the end state. A note I missed on the last slide about piling out in the bottom. Learned this from working with many of the local the people I've been fortunate to work with. Is building definitely to the canyon, the sides of the canyons. Your debris is going to be out of the way. But for the future, and then and really that stuff just isn't going to make such a big impact. I think there's a little older slide, but there's a big difference between the north and south aspects. Will you go one down, Brian, and see if you have that slide? This is the last one. Yeah. There's a difference in the canyons between the north and south aspects. The north aspects, that if you're standing on a slope and you're facing north, tend to be cooler and wetter. So here's a good example. So even some of those trees are cut. So if you pile over here on the canyon side, there's actually low risk with standing trees of it running. It might grab some of those trees on that north aspect, but generally it's pretty safe because there's not a lot of creep that happens in the scales underneath the cedars on the north aspects, in my experience. If you go over here on the westerly aspects, you can see my pickup there and to the right. That's really where the piles are going to want to take off in the grassy fuels. But especially during the winter time, that those south aspects are the first to lose snow. The north aspects, it's just a little safer spot to burn. The snow is going to stay on longer, and you're also going to have that debris out of the way if you're trying to work out in your pasture. You can go down to that last slide. And I just want, just another example. This is what Andy referred to as stuffing. It works well in the interior of the unit. There's a lot of pastures that have been cleared this way, and maybe they weren't even stuffed for the interior prescribed burn. It was just cutting the cedar trees to get them out, of the high forage areas and just out of the way. These piles won't burn either very well. You really got to have a pile that's oval, circular, and as tall as it is wide. You might get a little bit, but you really would just need to expand on that just to really get it to go. Unfortunately, again, that's the whole planning ahead. If this ends up being a fire break like Andy's talking about to the right, and then you're going to have all this slash, they're going to end up having to move, frankly, and be quicker. If you don't have that, you can do anything you want with a chainsaw, but that pile would need to be added to and burned well ahead. And really, like, to end my little bit here, is just to make sure not to just think it's burning your pile in your backyard, and the snow doesn't have issues. I've heard many times that piles cause more issues than broadcast. The broadcast burns just because of the planning, the amount of people involved in the broadcast. A lot of times, pile burning, you're on your own. Maybe get a neighbor to help, and it's really easy to get lulled to sleep. I feel like when you're lighting in a blizzard, but then you're going to end up with a bunch of work at the end. And frankly, all this entails work. So if you can do that stuff ahead of time, plan it out, you are going to have a lot better success in the end. And just and really, just for the sake of years, departments is just to continue to monitor those piles until they're cold. Whether you get a snow later, hopefully a rain, or you go continually monitor those piles, reasonably. Hopefully, snow stays on the landscape for a while, but just continue to monitor. And yeah, the last tip got is just don't light any more piles than you can handle. So you get 40 slash piles by yourself, it's supposed to warm up the next day. Maybe just take one pile and be able to babysit that. So that's my presentation. I apologize for the technical issues.
Thanks, Mark. We got some time for some questions. I think Scott's at a basketball game and I think had to jump off. I'm not sure he's on, but if anybody wants to jump on, Mark Alberts from the Central Platte Rangeland Alliance, if you're on, if you want to throw in your perspective about brush piles that you've seen over the years, feel free to do that if you can unmute yourself and chat about that. Or ask any questions. Anybody else has any questions, we'll be happy to answer the best we can. I know we're over time here, but.
Okay, am I on?
Yep, we got you, Mark.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm Mark Alberts. I work with Central Platte Rangeland Alliance. I'll just give you a couple of minutes. As far as burning piles in the wintertime, I think I've had more failures than I've had successes. We think we're going to burn with snow on the ground, and that's a good idea. That's a good thought. But when you have snow on the ground, there's if you've had wind with your snow, your piles probably sucked up snow. And if you have that gentle wet snow that just lays a blanket, then you got a blanket of snow on top of your piles. I guess kind of echoing what Mark Frickle has said, a bigger pile, I like that. And being able to push it together. I used to like to put piles like the end of a canyon, end of a pocket, and that way I use that to ladder fuel to burn those other trees, but it doesn't dry out, and so you're just fighting snow. You can't. So I would rather have my pile out in the open where I can push it together. I know one guy who's made a kind of a long rake. It's probably, I don't know, a dozen, maybe 15 feet long. He's got it on the end of a skid loader, and he can push those piles together without being driving in the hot ash. If you're burning deciduous trees, especially small logs, short logs, they burn a lot better. Even Mark Frickle's commented about a chainsaw. You can go out there and just score some of those trees. You don't have to cut them clear into pieces, but if you score them, that the fire has a chance to burn the sap, to get the sugar burning. To get the file going, I've used wood chips. You can go buy a 40-pound bale of wood chips at Orscheln and soak it in drip torch fuel. That helps get your fire going. I like a compressed air sprayer, pump up sprayer, spray drip torch fuel in there, and I don't spray it, all over. I kind of get one spot going, get it hot, keep that fire going. Last thing is you're burning. You got snow on the ground. It's awful tempting to be out there in your muck boots. If you got to throw logs in, if you're out, your muck boots will melt. Your leather shoes will dry out. Leather shoes with a grip sole. Wear leather gloves. I mean, that's just some safety precautions. We've it was mentioned, the day of the burn. We see the weather. Well, what's the weather going to be like 4 or 5 days, a week later? I had an uncle that burned some cottonwood trees this many years ago. Got them going. About a foot of snow. The next week we had a real nice melting week. So it was a week to the day later. The snow had all melted. The wind came up, rekindled some of those big logs. He had a wildfire. Um, um, so I mean, that's just things I guess we've all mentioned. I'm just reiterating them. Be safe. Um, after a prescribed burn, and after a prescribed burn, everybody's tired. But if you can go around with a loader, bobcat or something, something that you're comfortable in, not too hot. You'll have a lot of unburned trees. It pays you well to go and try and shove them together while you still got some heat. Plus you're monitoring your burns, but shove some of those piles together after prescribed burn because you will have unburned trees. So that's just pretty much a few things I've learned, and like I said, I've had more failures than successes burning in the wintertime, but I do like the idea of putting your pile out kind of in the open where you can shove it together. Otherwise you're just going to have your center burned out. You're going to have a big donut of trees all around it. So that's about all I've got to say. So are there any questions?
Thanks, Mark.
Okay.
We got a question here. Has there been any research on soil building after chipping and broadcast burns versus pile burns? I'm not sure if there's any research necessarily out there, but I know that just from personal experience, I can give you that we had some chipping done and it burned up, and we've had a couple fires over them, and it looks like, the grass came back beautifully. Some of the brush pile areas, if you get them hot, you can kind of sterilize some of the soil if they're really, really hot. And I monitor those areas where those piles were for woody encroachment, especially like sumacs really like to colonize those areas. So checking those out, making sure, but eventually most of that stuff just goes through a period of succession. And you basically manage it the way the rest of your ground is. But has anybody else had any experience with chipping versus piles, and what kind of the vegetative responses on those and soil response?
I've heard claims that chipping or mulching can help sequester soil moisture, and it may suppress vegetation for a time, but eventually it's going to come back. I think generally it's considered beneficial.
Yeah, I was pretty concerned about the chipping that we had done because they're big trees, and there was a pile of mulch on top of it, and after we did a couple burns on it, the grass came back really well, so that was pretty good. But I do have a few piles, really big piles that we burned where it took a few years for the grasses and stuff to move back in, but then it seems like those sumacs really like to colonize those areas, so we've had to kind of go in and monitor those areas and spray the sumacs from taking over in some of those areas. Tell made a comment about burning piles in the spring on rainy days. Tell, do you want to elaborate on that? Of your experience with those?
That's been our best pile burning time, but you got to know what your weather's doing. I think a lot of people would probably really disagree with me. But in our experience, it is greening up, and it's rainy or was rainy the day before and the day of, and you got some cloudy days forecasted. We tend to get complete combustion that way, and you don't have anything hiding under the snow. So you burn the pile and then just throw the stuff on the edge in. You're pretty much cold all around the outside that way. If you have a lot of really big piles, maybe that's not the way you want to do it, but that's been really good for us.
Yeah, I think, yeah, be a little careful, if you don't have a lot of experience or don't have time to kind of hang around with a pumper unit, especially if it gets really warm and dry the next few days. But yeah, I think definitely smaller piles, you can get away with that, I think.
Tell, it's Andy.
Yeah.
What month were you talking and was it already green?
Yeah, we have really good luck in May. We're kind of calving heifers early May, and we'll get some drizzly, rainy days, foggy days, and we'll kind of pick on those to burn a few piles. Like I said, we don't just light everything up, but for those people that are wanting to get more comfortable with it, if they got their four-wheeler with a little sprayer unit there, man, you can burn a decent sized pile, and it's a good way to get started. But uh, to each their own. I don't pick on heavy snowfall. This last snow was really wet. We had ice before it. I would not burn any piles this last time just because that stuff sits around and smolders, and it's a pain to monitor. So.
Any other questions or anybody else have any perspectives they want to share before we jump off? We're pushing a half hour past our time here, but people are still on. All right. Well, I don't see anything or hear anything. So thanks everybody for their perspectives, and Andy and Mark for jumping on and joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'll be happy to answer any questions or help you get a plan going. So thank you all for coming. Thanks for the Nebraska Environmental Trust too, that helps us get on and help put on these presentations throughout the year as well too. So appreciate everybody's time.